Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Friday, the 3rd of November. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined this evening by Martyn Day, the SNP MP for Linlithgow and East Falkirk since 2015. Welcome, Martyn. How are you?
Not bad, and I hope our audio holds up because my internet seems to be a bit ropey tonight. So, my apologies in advance.
Yeah, not. I'm sure it'll be fine. Just for the viewers at home, we had a couple of wee gremlins crept in there just before we went live. And Martyn, also, I was just going to say you were previously a councillor in West Lothian before you became the SNP MP for
Yep.
Linlithgow and East Falkirk since 2015. So welcome. So I'll move on to our Ukraine update. Day 618. Russia launched its largest drone attack on Ukraine for weeks earlier today, hitting critical infrastructure in the west and south of Ukraine and destroying private houses and commercial buildings in Kharkiv. The Ukrainian Air Force said it shot down 24 Shahid drones out of 40 launched by Russia, with Kharkiv, Odessa, Kherson, Ivano-Frankivsk and Lviv among the targets. Ukraine's Air Force said the latest drones were launched in several waves and flew to different regions in small groups. Air alerts in some regions lasted for several hours during the night. No casualties were reported, but Lviv's governor said an infrastructure facility had been hit 5 times during the attacks. A military facility was hit in Ivano-Frankivsk, and Kharkiv's governor said drones had hit civilian infrastructure and caused fires in and near the city of Kharkiv. Officials say Ukraine is bracing for a second winter of Russian airstrikes on the energy system, which they warn is more vulnerable than it was last year, as it has less excess capacity and little in the way of spare equipment. In Russia, Foreign Office spokesperson Maria Zakharova has dismissed the latest round of US sanctions against Russia. Yesterday, the US State Department imposed new sanctions targeted at Russia's future energy capabilities, sanctions evasion, and the manufacture of suicide drones. The Biden administration added a dozen Russian companies to a trade blacklist and announced a crackdown on sanctions evasion in the UAE, Turkey, and China. President Vladimir Putin has signed a law withdrawing Russia's ratification of the global treaty banning nuclear weapons tests. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken criticised Russia for leaving the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and called on Moscow to commit not to test. Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, said yesterday that she was confident that the European Union next month would advance Ukraine's bid to join the bloc at a summit seen as a key milestone in Kyiv's efforts to integrate with the West. Germany proposed a detailed and innovative roadmap to expand the EU that would give candidate countries such as Ukraine early benefits, including observer status at leaders' summits in Brussels before full membership. Russia rejected comments from Ukraine's most senior military official that their nearly 2-year conflict had reached a stalemate. Mike Johnson, the US Republican House of Representatives Speaker, has said that a bill pairing Ukraine aid with US border security will come next after the body's vote on a standalone Israeli aid measure. The Biden administration planned on delivering $425 million in new military aid to Ukraine, Reuters has quoted 2 US sources as saying. The officials said the long-term money will be provided through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which funds contracts for larger weapons systems that need to be built or modified by defence companies. Russia said yesterday that it had handed jail terms to 2 Ukrainian soldiers who fought in the city of Mariupol as it continued to put dozens of captive soldiers on trial. Thousands of Ukrainian fighters were taken prisoner after Russia seized control of Mariupol last May, some of whom were sent to Russia or tried by Moscow-backed courts in occupied East Ukraine. Rights groups and Western countries have criticised Moscow for putting captured Ukrainian soldiers on trial. Polish truckers will block several border crossings with Ukraine starting next week in protests at what they say is Ukrainian haulers' free rein in Poland that is hurting their business, a co-organiser of the protests said. Martin, I meant to say at the top of the show that today we're going to, or this evening, we're going to be just doing headlines and bullet points before we go on to discuss in detail the new proposals published by the Scottish Government. But just before I move on to the Israel-Gaza conflict, was there anything in there that in the Ukraine update that caught your eye?
Yeah, nothing in particular. I think it's just so depressing how long this conflict's dragged on for, and we don't seem to be any closer to a resolution now than we were when it began. And I think that's the tragedy of armed conflict is we just don't get to the end of it unless there's some sort of peaceful negotiation. And I don't think anyone can have a negotiation with Putin's Russia. So it just seems to be never ending.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I think you're right. I mean, and yet it's quite a long update, so it shows that there is still quite a lot happening.
Yeah.
But I'll go on to the latest on the Israel-Gaza conflict. Israeli forces have completed the encirclement of Gaza City and are fighting with full force, Israel Defense Forces, or the IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari said. The Chief of Staff of the IDF, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, said troops are surrounding it from several directions and deepening the ground offensive inside the city. Israeli strikes have killed 9,061 people since the 7th of October, including 3,760 children, the Health Ministry in Gaza reported yesterday. The current conflict began on the 7th of October when Hamas attacked southern Israel, killing more than 1,400 people and taking hostages. It has not been possible for journalists to independently verify figures from either Israeli or Palestinian authorities. In the US, the Republican-led lower chamber of Congress has passed a $14 billion aid package for Israel, defying President Joe Biden's request to also include more money for Ukraine and other pressing priorities. The bill, which diverts funding budgeted to the US Tax Collection Agency, is almost certain to fail in the Democratic-controlled Senate, while Biden has also threatened to veto it. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, will urge the Israeli government to agree to a series of humanitarian pauses to the fighting in Gaza. Blinken said yesterday that he would seek concrete steps from Israel to minimise harm to civilians in Gaza. He is expected to spend today in Israel, his fourth visit since the 7th of October, before other engagements in the region. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, or the UNRWA, said 4 of its schools in Gaza that are being used as shelters have been damaged in less than 24 hours. The agency said in its latest update that at least 20 people have reportedly been killed and 5 others injured yesterday after a school that is being used as a shelter was damaged at the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. The Gaza Health Ministry said at least 27 people were killed in a blast near the UN school in the Jabalia camp yesterday. At least 15 people have been killed after a blast in the Bereji refugee camp in central Gaza yesterday, a health ministry said. A spokesperson for Gaza's civil defence said the blast took place in a residential building and residents reported scores of people trapped beneath the rubble. 18 Israeli soldiers have been killed amid fierce fighting in Gaza, according to the IDF, in a series of incidents during their attempts to push further into built-up areas of Gaza. Mohammed Abu Hattab, a journalist working for the Palestinian Authority's television channel, was killed along with 11 members of his family in their home during an Israeli strike. News agency the WAFA or WAFA has reported. He is the 36th journalist killed in the conflict, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militant group, said it had attacked 19 positions in Israel yesterday. The strikes came hours after Hezbollah said it had used 2 drones packed with explosives to attack an Israeli army command position in the disputed Sheba Farms area on the Lebanese-Israeli border earlier in the day. It is the first time Hezbollah has acknowledged carrying out an attack against Israeli forces using such drones. The Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt opened for a second day to allow the evacuation of some injured Palestinians and foreign passport holders. The UK Foreign Office has confirmed that British nationals were able to get out of Gaza yesterday. Joe Biden has said that the US has been able to get 74 dual citizens out of Gaza. A spokesperson from the Palestinian side of the crossing stated that a total of 400 foreign passport holders, as well as 60 severely wounded Palestinians, were due to cross by the end of Thursday. A Japanese military, before I move on, I'll just say that we will be coming back to the First Minister's family later in the show. A Japanese military plane departed Israel yesterday carrying 46 passengers, including 20 Japanese nationals, the Japanese Foreign Ministry said. Passengers aboard also included 15 South Koreans, 4 Vietnamese and 1 Taiwanese, the ministry has said today. The World Health Organization said it was almost impossible to bring humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. The World Health Organization's Emergencies Director, Michael Ryan, said the basic safety of staff could not be guaranteed at the moment. The Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, said the situation in Gaza was indescribable. A group of United Nations experts have called for a ceasefire in Gaza, warning that time is running out as Palestinian people there find themselves at grave risk of genocide. In a statement, they expressed deep frustration with Israel's refusal to halt plans to decimate the Gaza Strip and said they felt deepening horror about the Israeli airstrikes against the Jabalia refugee camp. The US will not seek to impose any conditions on the support it gives Israel to defend itself in the wake of the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October. Vice President Kamala Harris has said, she refused to comment on Israel's bombing of the Jabalia refugee camp, adding, "We are not telling Israel how it should conduct this war." Several people have been killed and dozens wounded in an Israeli strike on an ambulance convoy near the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza, the Palestinian Health Ministry has reported. The convoy was carrying critically wounded patients from the hospital to the Rafah border crossing when it was hit. Martyn, that was a really long update, but was there anything there that you maybe wanted to comment on?
I suppose really just how depressing the whole situation is. I mean, there are thousands dead, tens of thousands injured, and hundreds of thousands displaced, and there's there is no justice. And as the UN experts have said, there's a grave risk of genocide. I mean, this should be sending alarm bells right around the world that we need to be shouting with one voice that there needs to be a ceasefire. We will not solve this problem unless there's peace. You don't get peace through violence. You get peace through strength, and we've got to show strength that this just isn't acceptable. Every life is of value, irrespective of whether it's Palestinian or Israeli. And when you think over 3,000 Palestinian children killed, not one of them was a Hamas terrorist. But the grief and the pain that causes families and injured children, it breeds terrorism in future generations. This has to be brought to an end, or we will just escalate. And the scenario we've heard there of Hezbollah, the risk of escalation there, and I blamed the UK government foreign policy and a whole range of things, but it's certainly never taken a strong enough action against Iran, which has been funding and arming these terror groups. So it's complicit, and then it's complicit in its support, its uncritical support for Israel in its treatment of the Palestinian people, which is again unacceptable. And there's an angle that I don't think we've seen much mention of in the press yet, and that is that there are certainly from the UK estimated to be hundreds of people who've gone over to Israel to actually fight in this conflict. So what is the UK Home Office going to do when these people return to the UK? They may be implicated in possibly even war crimes. I mean, the reality is we know that some of the action Israel's taking against the Palestinians does not comply with international law. So what do we do about UK citizens that go across there and take part in that? We've got a whole host of issues that need sorted out here.
Thank you, Martyn. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run through some headlines before we get to discuss the new SNP paper on migration.
Yep.
We'll come back to you. Thank you for your patience, Martyn. So the UN hopes that the UK will not renege on net zero commitments. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is expected to seek assurances that the UK will not walk back its previous climate promises, expressing concern following the Prime Minister's decisions to scrap or dilute various climate policies that the country may be backsliding on its pledges since COP20 or ahead of COP28. Tech firms, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has announced that advanced technology companies will allow the government to vet their artificial intelligence tools. The announcement that companies such as Meta, Google DeepMind and OpenAI have agreed to allow regulators to test their latest AI products before releasing them to the public on the second day of the two-day AI Safety Summit at Bletchley Park. 5 people have now been confirmed dead in Tuscany as Storm Ciarán causes severe flooding in Italy. The storm, which wreaked havoc in the UK, mostly in the south of England and Wales and the northwest of Scotland, earlier this week it damaged buildings and left over 10,000 homes without power, and has now swept across Western Europe with a total of death toll now at 13. Conservative politician Bob Stewart, MP for Beckenham in South East London and former British Army officer, has appeared in court today at the Westminster Magistrates Court in relation to an incident last year outside the Bahrain embassy where he told protesting activist Saeed Ahmed Al-Wadi that he was, quote, taking money off my country and to go back to Bahrain. Mr. Al-Wadi told the court he was exercising his right to protest at the time and that Stewart's word made him feel dehumanised. Stewart was charged with a racially aggravated public order offence and pleaded not guilty to using threatening or abusive words or behaviour likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress. And lastly, First Minister Humza Yousaf expressed deep personal relief felt by himself and his family as he confirmed that his in-laws have successfully escaped Gaza. Elizabeth and Maged Al-Nakla, the parents of Nadia Al-Nakla, the First Minister's wife, were named among 92 British nationals permitted to pass through the Rafah border crossing into Egypt on Friday morning. That's this morning. The El Naklas were in Gaza visiting relatives when the conflict began, and the First Minister has shared regular updates on their situation. In a statement today, Mr. Yousaf and his wife shared a statement saying, "We are very pleased to confirm that Nadia's parents were able to leave Gaza through the Rafah crossing this morning." They went on to say, "We are very grateful to all of those who have assisted our parents over the last few weeks, including the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office crisis team. These last 4 weeks have been a living nightmare for our family," they said. "We are so thankful for all of the messages of comfort and prayers that we have received from across the world and indeed from across the political spectrum in Scotland and the UK. They added, "Although we feel a sense of deep personal relief, we are heartbroken at the continued suffering of the people of Gaza. We will continue to raise our voices to stop the killing and the suffering of the innocent people in Gaza." They reiterated their calls for an immediate ceasefire, the opening of a humanitarian corridor so that the aid could fuel the flow into Gaza, so that aid, and including fuel, could flow into Gaza and for all hostages to be released. So Martyn, that's the end of our headlines there. I was just wondering, you probably know the First Minister, Humza Yousaf. Have you had a chance to speak to him, or have you heard anything about since his family got back?
No, I've not had a chance to speak to him, but I think we're all relieved that he's relieved. His immediate relatives have been able to get safely out, along with the other UK nationals. But of course, that still leaves all the relatives and friends that they would be visiting in the danger zone, and our thoughts and prayers remain with the Palestinian people at large, and let's hope we can get a resolution that at least saves lives, if not rebuilds their futures.
Thanks for reminding us. Sorry.
Yep, I was going to add the other bit of news regarding Bob Stewart, the Tory MP who was fined in court today. £600 is all he's been fined for his racially aggravated abuse of Saeed. And I know Saeed personally because I've done a bit of work with the Bahrainian political protesters over the last number of years. And Bahrain, while an ally of the UK, has one of the worst human rights records in terms of political prisoners. It has the largest per capita number of political prisoners of any nation in the world. So, there's a lot of issues there with Bahrain, and I think Bob's language was rather intemperate, and it's good that he's been fined. Although, what will the Tory party do now? Because is this racism institutionalised within their organisation, or will they remove the whip from him as a further penalty, which is what I think they should be doing.
Thank you for that, Martyn. And just before we leave the First Minister's family, I think you're right that the relatives that his in-laws were visiting, that includes his brother-in-law, who's a doctor in Gaza, isn't it? And he said that he would never leave Gaza as long as people need him. So we'll see what happens there. But our main discussion of the Scottish Government's release of a new paper on the future of migration in an independent Scotland. The Scottish Government has released a new paper today entitled Building a New Scotland, Migration to Scotland After Independence, which sets the Government's vision for a humane and principled migration policy after independence and describes how people seeking asylum and refugees would be welcomed and integrated into our communities and treated with dignity and respect. The paper sets out as its guiding principle that Scotland's population, well, I'll come on to things like that. Martyn, have you had a chance to look at the paper in detail yet?
Not in detail. I've only really seen some of the headline points from the paper. I think it's a very welcome addition to this discussion. This is a key plank of policy that we need for independence. It's also an area of policy where the UK government's policy has been sadly failing for a good number of years now. It's not fit for purpose. So we have, as a nation in Scotland, very distinct challenges. We have on one hand, we have an ageing population and we have a declining population. So in order for our long-term economic prosperity and the sustainability of our nation, we need young, economically active citizens. So if we don't have enough of our own coming through natural growth, we need to bring them in through migration. So we need a migration policy that meets our needs for the future going forward. And I think that's a really good step in the right direction.
It's the last of 6 papers. The first one was Independence in the Modern World. The second was Renewing Scottish Democracy Through Independence. The third was A Stronger Economy with Independence. The fourth was Creating a Modern Constitution for an Independent Scotland. The fifth was Citizenship in an Independent Scotland. And this one is Migration to Scotland After Independence. So it seems quite clear that the common theme in all of these papers is independence. And then and I'm just going to go on to say it was Shirley Ann Somerville, the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, who published the paper today. And I've got a bit of her statement today. She said, "For too long, Westminster governments have ignored the needs of Scotland, and in fact, worse than that, their harmful migration policies with their really disgraceful rhetoric coming through is impacting on our community cohesion and our ability to welcome people here as much as we'd like to." And we haven't gone on to any of the policies yet, but the strategy, which obviously includes that Scotland will be independent, as that's in the title, includes an immediate right for asylum seekers to claim benefits and to get paid employment and freely use the NHS. It's also talking about closing down the Dungavel Immigration Detention Centre in South Lanarkshire. It also proposes that there would be new working visas for a new 5-year post-study visa and a new family visa with much lower barriers than the UK currently uses. It also advocates rejoining the European Union to allow full free movement of EU citizens to Scotland and vice versa. And that includes those successful applicants for migrants to Scotland. Is there anything in that sort of, I'm just worried that this is a monologue. Was there which one of those would you maybe want to tackle first?
Well, I mean, it's all good stuff, and the reality is that it seems scandalous that the current UK system, which is basically a very hostile environment, and it's designed to, I think, take so long for people's applications to be processed and dealt with that they give up and just go away. I think that's the whole reason d'etre behind their current the inhumanity behind their system. So we need to cut through that and get a system that's fit for purpose. And it seems to me that if there are potentially economically active citizens here waiting for their applications to be processed, it's only right that they should be able to work and earn their own keep while they're waiting for that to be processed. And they shouldn't be sort of almost semi-imprisoned, shall we say, in sort of hotels or camps while these applications are being processed. So I think that's just far, far better for everyone concerned and better for our economy and allows us to develop as a society better. So all of that's to be welcomed. And I think I have a central belt constituency here in Scotland. We don't have huge numbers of immigration cases. We get a steady small stream. I think those who represent the cities will get considerably more than I do. But the family visa route and the distress that families go through with their constantly having to reapply every 2.5 years is heartbreaking to see. So we've got to make that easier for people, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be. It's an extremely stressful and financial burden on families that are here contributing. And if I use the cases that I deal with disproportionately, I'd say that they're people who are contributing to our health service and are absolutely vital workers for us. So that's what I'm seeing, and I'm glad that our policy is reflecting making that job a lot easier for them.
You mentioned Suella Braverman there. Would it be fair to say that this bill has been formulated in direct opposition to, or in direct response to Westminster's illegal migrant bill?
Well,
It kind of sounds like whatever Westminster says, we'll do the opposite.
Well, I suspect the rationale has been much more fair-minded than just reacting to what the fascist Braverman is saying at Westminster. But it'd be fair to say that we're unlikely to come to the same conclusions that she does. We've had to look at policy that reflects our needs as a nation, and our needs as a nation, as I said earlier, is we have an aging population on one hand and a declining population on the other. So we've got to get economically active people that fill the jobs that we need filled here. And this paper would help do that. So, and I think that's a marker for the likes of Braverman at Westminster, that we have very distinct needs that are not being met by the UK government's policies. And if they are not going to change their policy to suit our needs, there are two options. They could devolve migration powers to give us the ability to have a tailored system here within the UK. They will not do that. That's been asked for on numerous occasions, and that leaves us with independence, and that's the one route that we can take for ourselves, and that's the route we're going to have to use.
You've kind of half or started to answer my next question, which was, as you're down in Westminster as an MP, have you, well, how do you think this is going to be received in Westminster by the likes of Suella Braverman, especially when you consider that she won't talk about legal routes or illegal routes? She talks about irregular routes for asylum seekers to enter the UK. That kind of weird language. But yes, my main question is, how do you think it's going to be received at Westminster and by Braverman in particular?
Well, it's anything. I say this almost tongue in cheek, but anything that's sort of got a modicum of justice and fairness about it is unlikely to be received well by the likes of Braverman. I mean, the very language they use. I mean, they would try and have us believe that there's such a thing as an illegal asylum seeker, and clearly there isn't. So we need to be alert to the fact that they will put down, denigrate, and try and rubbish any positive proposal that comes out. But what we have to point out to our own public and to them is that we have distinct needs, and how are those needs going to be met? And if you look at an outcome-based approach, well, they won't be met by any of the suggestions coming out of Westminster. So we've got to do these things for ourselves, and this is I think a great initiative. We know from the economic evidence that the migration and migrants in particular put more into our economy than they take out. They tend to be younger and economically active. So it goes without saying that the more positive migration we can get to fill the gaps that we have in our economy, the better that is for everyone in our society. So we have a welcoming approach to migration. We are part of the world. We're not narrow and insular. It's not part of Brexit Britain. We have a very different approach to how we look at things, and welcoming people here and getting ourselves back into Europe is a big plank in that.
Thank you, Martyn. I promise viewers at home that we will be going into the paper in detail, but I'm just still kind of interested. The previous papers in the series, did they make any impact in Westminster? Did any of your peers in other parties maybe ask you about the papers that have been published, or have they ever featured in any debates, or any PMQs?
I think we make use of the papers because they're very well put together, they're well researched, and they give us a good platform to promote. Our opponents, of course, would like to put us all back in our box and hope that we go away, and that's not something that any of us are planning to do. So the papers are a good campaigning tool for us, and they're a good explaining tool for the general public that want a more detailed view of how we do certain things with independence, and the more of this we can do, the better result we'll get when the time comes.
Thanks, Martyn. And so I realise that you're an MP at Westminster and not an MSP, but is there an opportunity for these papers to get debated at Holyrood, or this?
You would probably need to ask one of the MSPs what the routes are. I presume that there will be debates on these things, but I can't tell you what the Holyrood mechanisms are. So I can certainly recall some of the previous papers being debated or debates around those themes. So I'm assuming that there's a mechanism there, and we'll watch with interest to see how that transpires.
Thank you, Martyn. And the bill does say that it hopes to improve the integration of migrants and asylum seekers, and to tackle human trafficking and exploitation in Scotland.
Yeah.
And we saw the scenes in Kenmure Street a wee while back now, but how will the bill improve or get rid of exploitation or trafficking in Scotland?
Well, I think the easiest step to get rid of exploitation and trafficking is to provide safe legal routes for people to get here. And that's the fundamental part that's missing from the UK approach. And because that is missing, people will use whatever means they can to get here and get reunited with friends and family that are already in this country legally. So that's the main way is provide a safe route, and then it's easier to crack down on the traffickers.
Thanks, Martyn. And this is almost like a bullets that we're firing at you, but you're coping really well. So the paper sets out a vision for a fair approach to migration policy, one with dignity, fairness and respect at its core. I know that some of the previous papers have had similar statements of fairness. I guess that can't be accidental. Do you want to say maybe why that's a thread that runs through them?
But it's interesting that you've pointed that out. I hadn't thought of that. I think it's just part of our social fabric is that we have a great belief in justice, and that should permeate through all of our policy decisions. Should be based on fairness and justice. So I don't think there's anything more than that is a base core line that should underpin everything we do. There's only one real reason to do anything, and that's because it's the right thing to do. And I think that's the case here.
Thank you, Martyn. And I did see some criticism in the mainstream media which pointed out that there's currently a housing crisis in Scotland. Glasgow City Council said it has to find homes for 1,000 asylum seekers in the next few months at a cost of £27 million. And that's the result of the Home Office planning to process asylum applicants much more quickly, which you can tell me if I'm right or not in this, I think they're just going to let them through. They're employing people to just do good web searches on where somebody's come from and then just say yes or no based on that. But if we've already got a housing crisis and in an independent Scotland, we would want to bring in more people. How could we do that? Or
Well, I think, if we have a housing crisis, and in certain areas we definitely do have that, the answer is to build more houses, and to build houses that are affordable, houses that people can live in. We've got away from that for many years. I'm pleased to say that, the Scottish Government has been behind the house building in a level that previous regimes had not been, but there's still a long way to go, and that's the key component there, is to build the appropriate type of housing in the communities where it's needed.
I guess that these asylum seekers and migrants, they will be craftsmen, they will be carpenters, plumbers, electricians, the kind of people that we need to build new housing stock. And that kind of brings me on to, there's a few case studies in the paper, and one of them is on tourism and hospitality, another on the accommodation sector, and one on the food and drink sector, and talking about how there's currently a lack of qualified applicants, and that businesses in these sectors can't fill vacancies. It also talked about agriculture, which I often think is interesting, because agriculture is an industry, although people don't tend to think of it as that way. They think of it as the countryside and farms and fields and trees and the like. But the agriculture industry has an impact on the food and drink sector, which is huge in Scotland. And so again, if they can't fill vacancies, then in agriculture, then that affects the whisky, salmon, and so I suppose, does that help the housing crisis in a sense?
I, I'm not sure if it helps the housing crisis as such, but it's certainly an area that the migration policies have caused issues with, and we've seen that with the post-Brexit scenario in my own constituency. I've heard from people with agricultural businesses who've not been able to get the seasonal workers they would normally have had. That's been a problem for them. I've heard from restaurateurs who have not been able to get the hospitality staff that they would need to run the sittings, the number of sittings that they would normally have been able to cater for. So it's definitely having a real impact on our businesses, and that's the bit we've got to address.
Thank you, Martyn. Another criticism I saw online from the mainstream media was that none of these policies would have been costed yet. But I'm guessing that as it's a paper, I mean, it's not even a bill or an act. The costs would come later after it's been debated and agreed, I guess. But is that figure?
I think it probably does figure. I mean, costs would come as you go through the detail of a proposal, but off the top of my head, I mean, the figures, and I can't recall figures, but the stats I've seen over the last number of years is that migrants then tend to add more into our economy than they take out. So, I think these kind of things would grow the economy rather than the other way around. So it's a question is, how much do we want our economy to grow, and do we want to fill the gaps that we have, or do we want a shrinking economy and well, more austerity? That's the tough choice, and it's not really a tough choice, because the answer is obvious. We want to grow the economy and have a better standard of living, so bringing in more young, economically active people helps us do that.
Thanks, Martyn. And that thing about, there's that one word that's peppered about maybe 4 or 5 times through the paper, and that word is Brexit. And one of the things that the report said about Brexit was that Scotland's economy would benefit from moving away from the UK's restrictive approach to migration under Brexit towards EU membership, free movement of people, and a sensible, open and welcoming migration system. And again, tell me if I'm wrong, but I guess this is how the paper suggests that we would be able to tackle trafficking and exploitation, as if we're back in the European Union. Is that right, or is that how you would understand it? Or
I say I've still to read the paper in detail, but I mean, I saw sort of two threads to the headline stuff that I looked at. One was the wider world migration issues and the asylum side of things, which UK policy is almost toxic on. So getting that right and boosting our economy is good. And the other part is the free movement that would come with reintegrating into Europe, which opens us up to a whole host of European workers coming and our citizens gaining their free movement and their ability to work and study throughout Europe. So I think the two aspects go hand in hand quite well together.
And this echoes something I think that you said earlier on. That another time that it mentioned Brexit in the report, it said migration from EU countries has been particularly important for Scotland over recent years, but Brexit and the Westminster government's refusal to recognise the need for a tailored approach to immigration policy to address Scotland's particular needs for people and skills risks significant problems for Scotland's economy. I guess you would agree with that, as it kind of echoes something that you already said.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And as I said, there are models elsewhere in the world where there is devolved forms of migration policy. So it's something that could be done under the UK as we speak now. They've chosen not to do that, which leaves us basically with only one option left, and that's to do it ourselves with independence, which is my preferred option anyway. But there are ways it can be done, and there's just a refusal from Westminster to look at migration in anything but the most almost xenophobic terms, which is part of what's holding the UK back.
And you've almost preempted me again, because that was going to be another one of my questions to you. Are there other countries that have got similar asylum migration policies? Would it be an outlier, or would Westminster be more of an outlier in terms of its asylum policies?
I think Westminster is very much an outlier. I mean, on a whole range of things, not always for the best reasons. In fact, very often not for the best reasons. Throughout the world, people have to form their own policies to suit their own needs, and our needs are quite clear. We have a good, thriving economy with modern industries, food and drink, but we've got a declining population and an aging population. So we need to address that, or our thriving industries will suffer.
Thank you, Martyn. And can maybe try and go into some of these items in detail. So one of the things that leapt off the page at me was that the mention of climate change and climate justice in the paper. The paper suggested that engaging with partner countries and communities at risk of displacement from climate change to explore whether a humanitarian visa would play a part in our wider approach to climate justice. So that's certainly something that is very topical, is it not?
It is. I have to say, I've not looked at that part of the paper at all yet. So I will need to look at that over the rest of the weekend and get my head around everything that's implied there. I think there is an aspect. While I've laboured the point several times tonight that we need to get a policy that suits our needs, we do also have to think of the rest of the world. And while we might want a particular type of health worker, and that might therefore mean we make that route easier for that type of person, we have to think about, do we deplete other countries of essential skilled staff, particularly developing countries that need those staff as well? So we do need to have a migration policy that suits our needs, but is also ethical for the rest of the world that we're working with. So I think it probably ties in with a lot of that as well.
Thanks, Martyn. The paper proposes, again, I'm reading from it directly, the paper proposes changes to the asylum and refugee policy rooted in human rights and equality, but it goes on to say that safe and legal routes available for displaced people and refugees is one of the things that they want. Again, so many questions. How would Suella Braverman react to that? But is that something that is that a good thing or not? That seems like a stupid question. But what do you say to that one?
Yeah, I can only imagine how Suella Braverman would react to that. They're trying to gaslight us all into thinking there's such a thing as an illegal asylum seeker, and there isn't. Asylum seekers have a legal right to have their cases heard. The problem is, how do they get here? And without a safe legal route, they're resorting to small boats and traffickers and being exploited and unfortunately, in many cases, being killed in the seas. So that is just that's an utterly unacceptable position we have at the moment, and we do need to find a way out that has humanity and treats people with decency and respect. And that means real asylum seekers get their cases heard and get the protection and safety they need, and those that aren't real can get returned to the countries that they come from.
Okay, so a big part of the paper was, let me see, was new visa routes that are being suggested. So we can maybe talk about some of them. The first new visa route is called the Live in Scotland visa route, and that would allow people to live and work in Scotland with their families without employer sponsorship if they meet certain criteria. That criteria would include a range of things like their age, their education, their skills and work experience, their earning potential, and whether they have any language skills with extra credit for knowledge of Gaelic and or English. And one of the interesting things about this is Holyrood's often accused of being sort of central belt centric, but the aim of this Live in Scotland visa route would be to tackle rural depopulation. So these people that would be coming in without employer sponsorship, if they meet the criteria, they'd be asked to live and work in parts of Scotland where their skills are most needed, so rural areas in the Highlands and Islands. How does that sound to you?
I think that sounds ideal. It's definitely something that we need, and the current UK routes, employee sponsorship in many respects almost feels like indentured slavery because people need to maintain that sponsorship in order to get their visa renewed, at the time of its next renewal every 2.5 years. So there's a real issue there for people and for families, and you want to know if you're coming here to work for a number of years, perhaps even forever in many cases, that you can do so safely with your family. And it's very stressful when I deal with family situations in my constituency that people have issues with their kids being able to stay here and as they get to a certain age and different things. So that ability to have your family is critical.
And thanks. And that word again, Brexit, even when it isn't mentioned, you can kind of feel it, that it's in there in the mix. It's kind of, I don't know, it's like a thread. So the second new visa route is called the Scottish Connections visa route. So the first thing it says is that people who have previously lived or studied in Scotland lawfully for at least 5 years would be eligible to come back to Scotland with the Scottish Connection visa route. So that to me sounds like an attempt to repair Brexit. Do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously, once we rejoin the European Union, we will have the free movement there anyway. I think where it's probably very good is the people who would have liked to have taken advantage of post-study work routes and weren't able to under different rules. So it would get people from potentially all over the world that have a knowledge of our country, our economy, and have been educated here, potentially back and contributing in a positive way.
And graduates who studied in Scotland for the degree would also be eligible for the Scottish Connections visa route, as would those with ancestral connections to Scotland. That's people with Scottish parents, grandparents, and the like. So that kind of sounds similar to the Irish system.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the Irish system, but it all sounds quite positive to me. It's about welcoming and bringing in people with pre-existing connections. They will integrate very easily into our society because they already are familiar with it.
Yeah, I mean that's how I see it. I mean, my dad was Irish, and so my understanding is that I would automatically be able to apply
Mm.
for an Irish passport and thereby get access to the European Union, just because my dad happened to be Irish. There's one that took me a while to work out, which is part of the Scottish Connections visa route still, where it says British nationals who are not British citizens can apply for residency, which to me sounded like a contradiction in terms, but I think what they mean is people like Hong Kong citizens.
Yeah,
So,
possibly. Yeah, I, it could well do. I would need to look into the detail of that
It,
before I was confident of saying that. But yeah, it could easily be there. Certainly, the current UK scheme has preferential routes for Hong Kongers, and a large proportion of those coming into the UK have been Hong Kongers.
I've got to give you credit for stepping up tonight, but yeah, it definitely is. The paper actually cites Hong Kong as an example of somebody that could be a British citizen, sorry, a British national who's not a British citizen. So you can rest assured there that it's people from Hong Kong and other places like that. So the next visa route is the Work in Scotland visa route. And this is an employer-sponsored visa route with simplified rules so that more employers can recruit migrants or refugees. The plan is that they would continue and expand a seasonal worker visa, which removes the need for workers to be tied to a single employer.
Mm.
And this is one of the main rafts where they hope to solve the problem or reduce the problem of exploitation and trafficking. Does that sound plausible to you?
I think it does, and that was the point I was making earlier when I said that some of these employer sponsorship is almost like indentured slavery. It ties people down, and this gets away from that and gives them a bit more flexibility. Which it's almost like going back to the medieval days when you hear of people having been tied to an employer and unable to therefore move around. So I think that's very much to be welcomed.
And another aspect of the Work in Scotland visa route is that there would be no minimum income requirement for family visas, which I think what that means is that I think, again, tell me if I'm wrong, but at the moment, Westminster says that only one person could come over, so maybe like the father, and then perhaps the wife and children and grandfather might be able to come at a later date. So I think this is saying that a family unit could come to Scotland together if they meet the criteria. Um,
Yeah,
All right, so the voice in my ear is telling me that it's about the amount of money that it's got
yeah.
nothing to do.
The-
Sorry, Martin,
no,
I'll let you go on.
yeah, no, the voice in your ear was entirely correct. It is to do with the salary threshold, and this threshold keeps getting raised. But it's not just I think this is the key part. It's not just the sheer level of salary that the main income holder. The main visa holder has before the rest of their family can be there on a spouse and dependent visas. It's the sheer cost that they have to pay every 2.5 years as well. So I mean, it's a horrendously stressful and expensive period for people. So anything that simplifies that has to be welcomed. I mean, we've dealt with families where the we've gone through some economic difficulties over the last number of years, and COVID hasn't helped there either. Where people's income has significantly dropped, and then they're stressing about whether they can keep their family with them. That's just totally inhumane.
And you mentioned simplifying the system. The Work in Scotland visa route does say that the complexity of the system is to be reduced for those applying with costs set as low as possible. So again, it
Yeah,
seems that they really want people to they want to make as much effort as possible to make it possible for people to come. I'm just checking my notes. I'm sure there was a reference to say that it wouldn't just be individuals that would be eligible to come and move to Scotland, that people could bring their families.
yeah.
But let's move on to asylum protections. There are three new legal routes for asylum seekers. An independent Scotland would open up a number of safe routes that would allow refugees to be resettled based on their skills and their experience and their aspirations rather than their vulnerabilities. Um, how does that sound to you?
I think it sounds ideal to me. It's treating everybody that comes here pretty much on a level playing field with fairness and justice, and it is about how they can benefit our society and our economy. And it's a win-win for everybody. We treat the people who arrive with respect, and they contribute. That to me is exactly what should be happening, and it's crazy that it's not been. When you hear the cases of asylum seekers, being penned up in hotels or are now stored on floating hotels offshore, it all seems quite unjust and inhumane, and they're left with virtually nothing to live on when they are capable of contributing. And that's the bit that's bizarre to me.
And I'm sure that a lot of these people, not only are they capable of contributing, but that was their aim, was to come
Yeah,
here, get a job, rent a flat, buy a house,
yeah,
and whatever. And I think, again, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think at the moment, um, it's from Westminster's point of view that asylum seekers are not allowed to work while they're waiting for their application
yeah.
to be processed, and they're being expected to survive on £5 a day.
That's correct, and
Um,
and the time scale for these processing is just phenomenal. It just drags on and on. Almost feels like a life sentence for people with no end in sight as to when their applications will be processed. So it's a very depressing situation for people to be in.
I mean, maybe you can help clarify that for my mind. I don't know about people at home, but um, I know that you're right when you say that these procedures, applications drag on and on and on. They're interminable, and yet earlier on I mentioned that Glasgow City Council's thinking is ready or trying to get ready for thousands of new seekers coming to Glasgow because the Home Office is speeding up the applications. And this is these people where I'm, I've heard that I've been hearing that the Home Office is employing people that are unqualified, and as I said, just do basic web searches before they give somebody a rubber stamp to come through, and that's speeding up. Have I understood correctly? Or
I I'm not familiar with the Glasgow numbers at all, if I'm being honest. So I can't really comment on that. But they certainly does not seem to be enough staff processing asylum applications, and the number of the backlog just seems to be growing and growing. So there's huge issues there, and I mean, it's all part of the hostile environment that they just don't want people in the country. But I mean, once an asylum seeker has made it here, they're sitting in limbo until they're processed, which is just deeply inhumane. And it would be a lot easier if they just processed them a bit quicker, I think.
And we're running out of time now, but just want quickly another asylum protection was that those unsuccessful in the asylum process in Scotland will not be detained as the current system does, and if necessary, any detainment would only be for a limited period of time. But I just want to ask you really quickly one more thing. The paper actually mentions the Windrush scandal
Mm.
and says that they want to enrich Scotland culturally, and they want to learn the lessons of the Windrush scandal. And that would mean that they don't just want to attract people from European countries, but they want to attract people from the global south. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of lessons to be learned from Windrush, and there've been other migration scandals in the UK as well. So we need to take all of that on board and have a system that's fair and treats people with dignity and respect. And uh, you know, could another Windrush happen in the future? And I don't know the answer to that, but hopefully not. I mean, I think people are much more documented now, so there's probably less risk of something like that happening. But I wouldn't put anything past the likes of Braverman and those at the Home Office.
And I'm going to be cheeky and maybe risk going over, but there was something else that was really interesting. And I'm just looking for the bit of paper with the note. The fact that Suella Braverman is going to, has just struck an agreement with Austria, and Austria is thinking about taking on a similar policy to the UK and sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. Which doesn't that prove that if you stayed in the European Union, we could still control our borders?
Uh, yeah, well, I think many of the Brexit stories were all red herrings to begin with. And I suppose, irrespective of whether a country's in the European Union or out of it, it can adopt totally bonkers policies if it so chooses. And that example is a very good example of one that's totally bonkers. I mean, Rwanda makes no sense to me. It costs far too much to administer and doesn't solve any of the problems that they claim it would solve. It just creates a burden and a cost to the taxpayer without resolving anything. So why any other country would copy that is beyond me.
And although it sounds like Austria is copying the UK, there's one key difference in that if an Austrian applicant's application is successful, then they are then able to leave Rwanda and go back to Austria and become a resident there, whereas that's not the case here in the UK. If your application is successful, you still have to stay in Rwanda. Martyn, thank you for that race through the new paper. Thank you for your patience with me as well.
That's okay, and then the next time I'll try and make sure I've read the paper fully before we chat about it. But hopefully the headlines were enough to at least get a debate going and get folk thinking at home.
No, it was good just to get to hear what you had to say about the points in the paper. That's great. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
So that's about it for this evening, but before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend, as you know, on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target bill is still pressing, but thanks to the generosity of you, our supporters, we have raised so far over £20,200. However, our need is to raise the remaining £9,800, and that is really urgent, believe you me. So on that rather depressing note, I'll just say good night and thank you for watching.